There's a big difference between cutting the Ukrainians off unilaterally and not caring about the rest of the country or Zelensky, or the United States working with Europe, providing hard security guarantees for the non-occupied components of Ukraine, helping them rebuild, integrating into the European Union, and using Russian assets as part of that rebuilding and defense. Now, the latter to me is still the Russians winning some Ukrainian territory, but the cost that they're paying for that is itself asymmetric. And I don't think the Ukrainians aren't winners, but the Russians sure as hell aren't winners in that environment, nor do I think that the Poles or the Balts or the Nordics would be unduly threatened by Russia if that were to happen.
I guess the big news to people in this country is JD Vance still joining the race. He'll be speaking tonight at the convention. A lot of news in this country, Ian, about JD Vance's views on Ukraine, on his lack of interest in supporting Ukraine, the sense that he's pushing a very isolationist view of America, and that will have consequences for Europe and the UK. What do you make of that narrative around Vance? Is that fair, do you think?
I would say that he, like Trump, are decidedly unilateralist. So it's not that they don't want the United States to play a leadership role around the world, but they're transactional. They won't coordinate with allies, and they'll demand a pound of flesh in return. That's what America first, sort of MAGA-style populism is. And Vance is certainly the most situationally and ideologically aligned with Trump in that regard.
Do they see the longer term part of that transactionalism? Because I'm interested in that. We had a NATO general on our program, former NATO general, saying the problem with compelling a settlement for Ukraine or withdrawing support from Ukraine is ultimately this strengthens Putin, and that puts Putin at Eastern Europe's door, on NATO countries' door in 5 years' time. And therefore, if you're trying to weigh up the value of supporting Ukraine, it can't just be in the dollars and cents in the next 12 months. It might be what happens in the next 5 years. Do you think that type of transactional view someone like Vance and Trump will be able to consider or will want to consider?
Look, first of all, I agree with the general sentiment that, if you kind of give the store to Putin, this is going to feel like an existential challenge to all of the frontline European states, and not just the frontline European states, would be a threat to NATO. It's certainly true that the escalation in the war has already had impact on NATO states. The level of disinformation, especially in France, in the run-up to their elections, in the run-up to the Paris Olympics from Russia, has been unprecedented. The assassination attempt against the CEO of the largest German defense company. This is not what you would call asymmetric warfare. That's warfare, right? So, definitely there are a lot of people inside Europe who think the other side of that equation, that we're getting into dangerous territory where we're risking our own equities over Ukraine. Now, I am of the view that under any circumstances, Ukraine is going to end up losing territory. There will be a partition of Ukraine. Not that the Ukrainians or the West is going to accept that, but that is the reality. I don't find this acceptable, but, frequently things happen in life that we don't think are acceptable. So that's my analysis. That's what I think is going to happen. But there's a big difference between cutting the Ukrainians off unilaterally and not caring about the rest of the country or Zelensky, or the United States working with Europe, providing hard security guarantees for the non-occupied components of Ukraine, helping them rebuild, integrating into the European Union, and using Russian assets as part of that rebuilding and defense. Now, the latter to me is still the Russians winning some Ukrainian territory, but the cost that they're paying for that is itself asymmetric. And I don't think the Ukrainians aren't winners, but the Russians sure as hell aren't winners in that environment, nor do I think that the Poles or the Balts or the Nordics would be unduly threatened by Russia if that were to happen. The thing that worries me the most about Trump and Vance is that whatever their plans on Russia, Ukraine, and they've certainly already been discussing it, they really don't care about coordinating with America's allies, right? So, I mean, if they have a peace plan that they're going to float with the Ukrainians and with the Russians, I fear that the Brits will find out on Fox or CNN. You may remember this already happened under Trump with no Vance when he was working the North Korea angle. So he says, I'm going to start talking to the North Koreans. And he agrees with Kim Jong-un on a freeze for freeze, that the North Koreans will freeze their ballistic missile testing. And in return, the Americans will freeze their military exercises with the South Koreans, which is, I think, actually a pretty useful thing to do, except the South Koreans literally heard about it when it was announced publicly by the Americans, which of course deeply undermined the South Korea's trust in their alliance with the United States. Now, Trump has very little value in building long-term trust in multilateral alliances or bilateral alliances. He views them as transactional. I think he is fundamentally wrong about that. Fundamentally. I think that America needs strong allies. But, you know, if you're promoting America first, you're already, from a marketing perspective, telling these other countries, we're more powerful than you are. You're going to have to suck it. You know, I mean, we're going to charge you if you want to have our defense. We're going to make it. We're going to take some money out of that. And this is basically, you know, Trump is a real estate guy, and he will sell you real estate if you are the highest bidder. And he doesn't care if you're a former criminal. He doesn't care if you're a relative, like whoever it is, like you'll get it if you pay the most. And unfortunately, that really does not translate well into public policy.
And he talks about that for Taiwan as well, actually.
Absolutely, he has.
In exactly those terms.
Yep.
We had his spokesperson on our program, and I said, would he regard Zelensky as an ally? She talks about the need to support allies, and she wouldn't say yes. She wouldn't even say he regards him as an ally. And I guess the question is there someone in the administration that's likely to be formed that says European security and American security, there is a direct line there, and that direct line is not just about a cash deal. It's actually about a web of alliance. And in order to get that security for America, you have to have security in Europe. And that means bringing everyone along. Or is that something that the mindset of Trump is never going to really grasp?
So look, you've conflated two issues here. You started talking about Ukraine and then you talked about NATO. And for Trump, those are two very different things. For Ukraine, Trump sees this as a tax on the American citizen. He thinks Zelensky's a great salesman. He's pulled one over on the Americans. It's a great deal for the Ukrainians, a horrible deal for the United States, bring the U.S. closer to World War III. I have some sympathy to some of that argument, but certainly I wouldn't go anywhere as far as Trump has. And if Trump becomes president, which now looks increasingly likely, then he's going to squeeze Ukraine pretty hard. If they don't accept a freeze with the present territorial delineation, he's going to work on cutting them off. Now, NATO's a different story. Trump has been pushing NATO very hard on spending more because during the 35 years of the so-called peace dividend, a lot of Europeans were very comfortable free riding on American defense spending.
And he's been right. I mean, he's been uniformly recognized as right, hasn't he, for that?
And now you've got 23 countries of the 32 members in NATO that are over 2%, and everyone's trending in the right direction. Now, I fully believe that Trump as president will take credit for a stronger NATO. And Putin deserves more credit. And Biden deserves some credit, but Trump deserves some significant credit there. And I don't think he's going to pull out of an alliance that he thinks that he made stronger. I think he's going to take a victory lap. And I think that you will see that his Secretary of State and Defense and Director of the CIA, that they will support that line. So, and I will tell you, I met with a lot of the leaders of NATO allies when they were all in Washington just a week ago. And a lot of them were deeply concerned about Trump and about Ukraine, but none of them had existential worries about NATO. That just wasn't an issue that was being raised.
I think that's such a fair point. And we've had NATO people on saying, actually, many people in the upper echelons of NATO welcomed Trump's comments. Even as president, he was coming in
Absolutely
and
true.
effectively blowing out the cobwebs and saying, "What the hell have you been doing for the last
Absolutely
20
true.
years?" And I feel that sounds very plausible. Let's talk about the Vance arrival on the political scene. I've heard it said that he's kind of a Trump figure that actually believes in things. He's kind of more Trumpian than Trump because he actually has ideologies he's loyal to and he wants to promote them, whereas Trump is more of an opportunist who's in it for all sorts of other reasons. Is that fair? Do you think there's a bit of an ideological backbone joining the Trump campaign with the arrival of Vance?
I think that JD Vance has the zealotry of a convert. And he is, in that regard, very aligned with Trump. As I said, Trump has a situational ideology. He has a transactional ideology. I think that Vance will line up completely on that. You may remember that Vance said that if he had the opportunity after January 6th, he would not have voted to support or certify those elections until after those states had been overturned and they had delivered their electors for Trump. Now, Vance is a Yale JD. He wrote Hillbilly Elegy. He is a smart guy. Does he actually believe that? That he believes that was rule of law? That's actually how to handle a transition? Or was that the absolute smartest thing for him to say to ensure himself the VP nod? And I think it's clearly the latter. And I think Trump respects that. Trump respects that kind of loyalty. This is not like Mike Pence, who, when push came to shove, was unwilling to stand by Trump and said, no, I'm not going to do something illegal that would break my view of a free and fair transition in this country. I'm not. I'm going to stand up to you. JD Vance would never do that. And yet JD Vance is young. He's energetic. And he does have policy chops. In some ways, in the Senate, he's been like a counter to Elizabeth Warren on the right.
And worked with her.
Absolutely. And so I think what you will see is much more of a Dick Cheney dynamic in terms of the amount of influence that JD has on policy formation in a Trump administration.
Maybe this doesn't matter, but there's an awful lot of people want to give JD Vance credit. Wrote Hillbilly Elegy, magnificent book, did really well, spoke to a movement, recognized some of the symptoms of American society, gave a voice to people who are historically voiceless, all of those things. But the notion of abandoning the rule of law to get on a ticket, does that matter? Is that just American politics? Is that just pork barrel? Or actually, is that something we should be worried about? That sort of moral slipperiness?
We should be worried about it. But we should be worried about it not because JD is in any way unusual in doing it. It's just that he's much better at it. I mean, Nikki Haley, right, was every bit that. It's just that she wasn't as effective. I mean, she pivoted late, and she was incapable of convincing Trump that, she was going to be there no matter what. So she got her place on the stage yesterday, and she said that she is strongly, unreservedly endorsing Trump, who she clearly sees to be unfit. I mean, that is a moral failing, right, on the part of Nikki Haley. That is putting personal ambition above party and above country. And certainly Vivek is doing that. Certainly David McCormick speaking yesterday is doing that. Certainly Ron DeSantis speaking yesterday is doing that. Certainly Ted Cruz is doing that. I see that happening across the board. So, I mean, the fact that JD Vance is one of 98% of sitting GOP members of House and Senate that are prepared to jettison a sense of morality and leadership and value so that they can promote their own ambition. I would not impugn Vance uniquely with that. He just happens to be better at it than the rest of them. And since we're talking about the Republicans, let's also recognize 2/3 of Democrats say that Biden should not be the nominee. Okay? I'm not a Democrat. I'm an independent, but I strongly feel that Biden should not be the nominee. He is way too old and incapable of running this country for another 4 years. And yet, almost all of the Democrats around him have publicly been unwilling to say that. So this is a failure of leadership in the United States, the most powerful country, and in principle, the most powerful democracy in the world today.
Let's talk about Biden briefly then, because that's such an excellent point. I mean, there doesn't seem to be a mechanism that will enable him to withdraw now. I mean, maybe there is, but it's very hard to see what it would be. I mean, it doesn't feel like the convention can do it. It feels like he's had his awful moment. That was the time to withdraw when really everyone was against him. As you say, 2/3 of Democrats want him gone. Is there a catalyst that changes his stubbornness? Because the people around him get their patronage from him, so they want to back him up. Is he unshiftable, do you think, at this stage?
And he could die. I mean, he is 81 and we have 3.5 months. So, I mean, from an actuarial perspective, that's not like a lottery ticket. That's actually plausible. But I mean, or have some catastrophic health ailment. But secondarily, Adam Schiff just came out in the last hour and publicly and said Biden needs to step down. Nancy Pelosi, the former speaker and a force of nature, has not missed a beat behind the scenes in coordinating and pushing people to get Biden to leave. That 2/3 figure came out today from AP. So, I mean, look, you are right. The mechanism is Biden has to step down. But if Biden's numbers continue to implode, which is, certainly plausible. Now, he has a floor because the U.S. is so divided and Biden voters are not going to go en masse and say, I'm going to vote for Trump. And he continues to see this kind of private and then public opposition in the weeks in the run up to the convention. I mean, Biden has said he has softened on the issue of only God Almighty will force him to drop. He has since said things like, "Well, of course, I need to see what the polls are doing and the rest." I mean, if he loses the public trust of his party, then I believe, Biden has a massive ego and he has, sort of all of the certainty of an 81-year-old man who you're trying to take the car keys away from him when he can't drive anymore. And that should be the Biden bumper sticker, right? Biden 24, let me keep the car keys, that's kind of where we are. But I think that ultimately, unlike Trump and Vance, I think that Biden cares more about the country than he cares about himself. I think that's true. I might be wrong. And that is going to be tested in the next weeks. Because if Biden actually is the nominee, right, after all of this, it really does imply that his judgment is horrible and that he's incapable of putting the country before himself.
We were just reflecting on in our election over here that a disunited party like the Tories over here cannot win, and a united party can. And it strikes me, the last 3 days, I've never seen a more united party really in my lifetime than the GOP seems with Trump. Now, it might be on the surface, but that cultish devotion to a great leader where people have to swallow their pride and support him, and many people don't even have to swallow their pride, they just love him. That feels like such a force of unity in comparison with Biden, which has all the feelings we've had with the Tories over here. Once people don't like each other and they snipe at each other and they don't all agree on the same direction, in some ways you're done, aren't you, as an electoral force?
I think that you're right, that in a close election, the fact that Trump has so much more enthusiasm among his base, not among Republican elites. I've taken phone calls. Late last night, I took a phone call from one of the top billionaire donors for Trump, who is deeply, Vance was his last place choice for VP, and he's deeply concerned that Trump is going to be a problematic leader of the United States. Though he's making that bet, he's still putting a lot of money into him because he doesn't like the alternative even more. I would say among Republican elites, their level of distrust, concern with Trump is actually still very high. But the unity and enthusiasm of the MAGA base is incredibly strong. That was true before the assassination attempt. And after it, when he rises up with that photo that looks like Iwo Jima, I mean, I don't care if you like Trump or not. I think that Trump is unfit for office, but I was inspired by that photo. I'm like, wow, that's impressive. I mean, that had been me, and you just shot me in the ear. Like, I'm staying on the ground, sort of with some Secret Service on top of me for a little longer. Like, I'm not standing up and putting my face to God knows who else is out there. I'm just not doing it. Right. And it is impressive.
One thing I'd just like to ask you before we go is the biggest worry for America not a big Biden win or a big Trump win, but a close win for someone, particularly a close win for Biden? Because presumably you've got Vance on the ticket now, who is a doubter about the last election. You've got Trump. Obviously, he's made his name out of saying that the last election wasn't done properly. Is that the biggest concern for America, actually? A close verdict, particularly a close Biden win, if that is still possible?
Oh, it depends on your time frame. I mean, the biggest short-term concern is exactly that, for the reasons you mentioned, because it will be contested. It will lead to lots of violence. The electoral process could potentially break under that. You could have a constitutional crisis. I agree, much worse than January 6th. Biggest long-term risk for the United States is Trump wins in a landslide. The filibuster is gone in the Senate. There are no checks on them. Supreme Court has just said all official acts are now have presidential impunity. Elon Musk, the richest and most powerful private sector man on the planet, throwing him huge money, buying Truth Social, turning it into a private sector voice of America for the right, while Vance and Trump are politicizing the Department of Justice, the IRS, and the FBI. That's a new McCarthyism. And in that environment, the United States feels more like Hungary, Serbia, or Turkey. It's not a dictatorship, but long term, that's the biggest danger. So it really depends on, what you're concerned about. But since, most Americans are only concerned about the short term, then from that perspective, you're right.
It's not heartening stuff to hear about, Ian, but it's fascinating stuff nonetheless. And you're a great man to talk to us about it. We really appreciate it.
Look, if we're not honest about this, then there's no point in even doing it, right?
Exactly right.
That's where we are.
Ian, great to speak to you. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Steve.
Thank you.